Hi, my name is Michal, and this is episode number 2 of the Homebound video series, where we discuss the Hashkafa and Torah aspects of living in Eretz Yisrael. So today I wanted to start with the basics. Is living in Eretz Yisrael a mitzvah? And if so, is it a mitzvah deraisa that applies nowadays? Why didn't the Ramban bring it down in his sefer mitzvos? Did R Moshe Einstein hold that it was a mitzvah or not? And what's the deal with the Satar view on living in Eretz Yisrael? Why are they so against it? We'll discuss all that today with Hashem's help. Now, of course, due to time, we're going to have to keep it somewhat brief. There's a lot to talk about, and we'll try to compact it the best we can while giving you the most information possible. So let's start from the ground up. Let's start with the undisputed view of the Ramban, Lichtman, who brings down clearly that Ish of Eretz Yisrael is one of the 613 mitzvahs, which is a mitzvah deraisa. He derives it from a straightforward pasuk in Parshas Maseh, which Hashem is speaking to Klal Yisroel, and he tells them, take possession of the land, dwell in it, because I've given it over to you. The controversies really begin with the Ramban. He wrote also a sefer mitzvos, where he brings down what he felt were part of the 613 mitzvos, and he did not bring down Yish of Eretz Yisrael as one of the mitzvos like the Ramban did. So the big question is, why? Why did he skip it? Did he skip it because he didn't hold it was a mitzvah deraisa? Or did he skip it because of some other reason? So let's look into this and see if we can figure this out. To figure this out, we're going to go step by step through some of the most famous and well-known commentaries on the Ramban as to why he didn't bring it down as a mitzvah deraisa. First off, we have the Ramban, again, like we just mentioned before, Nachmanides, who lived a little after the Ramban, and he writes a commentary on the Ramban, and he states that the Rambam Maimonides mistakenly left it out. Somehow it was a mistake. That's not for us to judge, but that's what he states. So next we have the Steichemed. He has a simple explanation. He states that the reason the Rambam didn't bring it down as one of the 613 mitzvahs is because the Rambam held it was a mitzvah derabanan and not deraisa, and the sefer mitzvahs only brings down mitzvahs deraisa. Thirdly, we have the Avnei Nezer. His commentary on the Rambam, he explains that the reason the Rambam didn't bring Yish of Eretz Yisrael down as a mitzvah is because he already included it in a different mitzvah. See, the Rambam writes as one of the 613 mitzvahs is to eradicate the 7 Canaanite nations that lived in Eretz Canaan, which is something that Hashem commanded Klal Yisroel. The only purpose for getting rid of those 7 nations is so that we can live in Eretz Yisrael. So he didn't need to bring it down as a separate mitzvah. It was simply part of the mitzvah of eradicating the 7 Canaanite nations. Next, we have a handful of Achronim. We have the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Yosef, and some others who bring a pretty straightforward answer as to why the Rambam didn't include Yish of Eretz Yisrael as one of the 613 mitzvahs. See, there are more than 613 mitzvahs deraisa, but because we have a Masorah that there are 613, the different Rishonim that wrote up a sefer mitzvos attempted to figure out which of the mitzvos best fit into the category of 613 mitzvos. Now the Rambam, in his introduction to the sefer mitzvos, he explains that mitzvos, which encompass many other mitzvos within it, he will not include in the count of 613 mitzvos. Therefore, Yish of Eretz Yisrael, because it is a prerequisite to many other mitzvos, he says in his own introduction that that's the kind of mitzvah he will not be bringing down as one of the 613. Therefore, he certainly held that it was a mitzvah deraisa, but in fact the opposite. Not that it wasn't a mitzvah, but because it was too big of a mitzvah and it was too broad of a mitzvah to bring down as one of the 613. So now I want to bring down some of the commentaries to the opposite effect, that possibly the Rambam did not bring down Yish of Eretz Yisrael as one of the 613 mitzvahs because maybe he held it wasn't one of the mitzvahs deraisa. So first off, we have the Megillas Esther, who stated that the Rambam did not bring down Yish of Eretz Yisrael as one of the 613 because the Rambam held it was not a mitzvah, at least not nowadays. Now, the Megillas Esther, written by Rav Yitzchak de Leon, he backs up his claim from a Tosfos in Mesechtes Ksuvos. Now, the Gemara there is talking about a husband and wife. If one of them want to live in Eretz Yisrael, they can force their spouse to move with them to Eretz Yisrael. So the Tosfos there, written by Rabbeinu Chaim, he comments, nowadays, when the Beis Hamikdash is not standing, somebody cannot force their spouse to move to Eretz Yisrael because he gives two reasons. It's dangerous to travel to Eretz Yisrael. And number two, because there are many mitzvahs that we need to fulfill when we live in Eretz Yisrael. And those mitzvahs are very difficult and complicated to fulfill, and better not to live there if we can't fulfill them properly. I would like to go through some of the counter commentaries on the Megillas Esther and some of the explanations on the Tosfos of Rabbeinu Chaim that explain why his view was misinterpreted. Now, there are many commentaries, but let's just touch upon some of the most straightforward and some of the most famous commentaries on this Tosfos and on this Megillas Esther. So for his first reason, it's pretty obvious and pretty straightforward that reason no longer applies. See, in his days, he was a Rishon. In his days, it was most certainly a danger to live or to travel to Eretz Yisrael. Nowadays, as I'm sure we all can agree, that is no longer the case, and Rabbeinu Chaim would probably not have felt or stated that reason nowadays. Now, turning to his reason number two, which is one should not live in Eretz Yisrael because of the many mitzvahs and the many complications of those mitzvahs, and we will not be able to fulfill those mitzvahs properly, and better not to live in Eretz Yisrael than to live in Eretz Yisrael and not be able to fulfill those mitzvahs properly. Now, the Chidah comments on this, and he states that it's true in Rabbeinu Chaim's day, again, many years ago. Now, there weren't so many Jews living in Eretz Yisrael back then. There were many halachic issues with the different mitzvahs of living in Eretz Yisrael, Shemitah and Yovel and Trumas and Meisters. And in his days, those controversies, those issues were not yet resolved. But the Chidah comments that nowadays, we have the final psak. We have decided the rulings on all of these halachic issues. So that issue that Rabbeinu Chaim had no longer applies nowadays. And due to this, the Chidah held that nowadays, Rabbeinu Chaim would certainly have felt that it is again a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael, being that his reasons no longer apply. Now the Marit, he has another explanation altogether. He felt that this Tosfos of Rabbeinu Chaim wasn't even an original. This Tosfos was actually amended by a later student of Rabbeinu Chaim, who mistakenly added in this view, which was not a authentic view of Rabbeinu Chaim. So the Marit dismisses this Tosfos altogether as being illegitimate and unauthentic. Now, the second and probably the most famous anti-Yishuv Eretz Yisrael view comes from the Satar Rebbe, the Satar community, and he bases his view off of also a Gemara in Kesubos, which is actually, the Gemara is a discussion between two Amoraim, where they're discussing three oaths that apparently Hashem pushed upon the Klal Yisroel and the nations of the world, the Goyim, and the three oaths are as follows. Number one, Klal Yisroel would not ascend in a wall-like fashion back into Eretz Yisrael against the wishes of the Goyim, of the nations. That's number one. Number two is that Klal Yisroel would not rebel against the Goyim. And number three is for the Goyim. Number three is that the Goyim would not overly suppress and hurt Klal Yisrael during their Golus. So now, of these three oaths, obviously the first oath is what the Satar Rebbe bases his view upon, that Klal Yisrael would not ascend to Eretz Yisrael in a wall-like fashion against the wishes of the nations. Now, first off, the Gemara states that we will not ascend in a wall-like fashion, which means we will not ascend as a group, as a whole, as a nation, in unity, back to Eretz Yisrael. But there's no prohibition, there's no oath against an individual Jew moving to Eretz Yisrael on his own. It's only against Klal Yisrael as a whole, or in a large group. So this Gemara right off the bat does not prohibit an individual Jew from living in Eretz Yisrael or moving to Eretz Yisrael. Secondly, Rashi comments on this Gemara that the Gemara states clearly that Klal Yisrael is only not allowed to force their way back to Eretz Yisrael against the wishes of the nation. But nowadays, we live in Eretz Yisrael, we acquired Eretz Yisrael, not against the wishes of the nations. In fact, the United Nations, or back then it was, I believe, called something else, but in 1948, when Eretz Yisrael was established, it was established with the permission and the consent of the United Nations. So, even according to Rashi, we are absolutely not in any violation of this oath. A third proof that this oath has no validity is the Shulchan Aruch brings down as Halacha that if two parties, if two people make an oath to each other, and one of the parties violates the oath, goes against it and breaks it, then the other party is absolved and no longer has to keep to the oath. Now, oath number 3 in these 3 oaths is that the nations of the world should not overly suppress Klal Yisroel while we are in this galus. Now, it is quite clear that we have been overly suppressed. We have the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, and the pogroms, and everything else. Now, according to Halacha, according to the Shulchan Aruch, if they broke their side of the oath, we no longer have to keep to ours, and we are absolved, and we can move to Eretz Yisrael, even in Mass. Now, a fourth reason that this Gemara doesn't have validity to us is because it is an Agadata Gemara, and it really has no bearing on Halacha. In fact, none of the major halachic works, not the Shulchan Aruch, or the Mishnah Berurah, or the Rif, or the Rosh, or anyone else, brings this Gemara down. And again, like we said, even the Satmar view only holds that Klal Yisroel should not ascend in Mass, and also that Klal Yisroel should not create a government. But that's not what we're trying to do. We would like simply to move to and live in Eretz Yisrael to fulfill the mitzvah, and there's absolutely no prohibition there. I'd like to now touch upon the view of R Moshe Einstein. There are many people who mistakenly quote R Moshe Einstein as holding that there is no mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael to live in Eretz Yisrael. But that is absolutely not the case. That is absolutely not true. R Moshe Einstein writes that living in Eretz Yisrael is not a mitzvah chiyuvis, it's a mitzvah kiyuvis. He explains as follows. He compares it to the mitzvah of tzitzis. Wearing tzitzis is a mitzvah deraisa, certainly, but you don't have to wear a four-cornered beged. Only if you decide to wear a four-cornered beged are you chayiv in the mitzvah of tzitzis. So R Moshe Einstein says that Eretz Yisrael is a similar case. You don't have to live in Eretz Yisrael. You're not chayiv to live in Eretz Yisrael. But if you decide to live in Eretz Yisrael, you most certainly do fulfill a mitzvah deraisa. So for anyone who was under the impression that Moshe Einstein held that living in Eretz Yisrael was not a mitzvah, he certainly held and wrote that it absolutely was a mitzvah. Another contemporary posek that held very much it was a mitzvah deraisa to live in Eretz Yisrael is the Chazon Ish. As we know, he lived in Eretz Yisrael, he was a lover of Eretz Yisrael, and he writes in a letter, as we all know, the Ramban and the Ramban held it was a mitzvah deraisa to live in Eretz Yisrael, and then he goes on to say that, as we know, the Chafetz Chaim very much yearned to live in Eretz Yisrael and tried very hard to get here, to Eretz Yisrael. Now, I'd like to end off with a story that Rev Shalom Gold, who just recently passed away, Olav Shalom, and he was a famous lover of Eretz Yisrael. He wrote in his autobiography a story of a man from America who was looking into the subject, as we just discussed, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and he flew down to Eretz Yisrael and tried to set up a meeting with Rev Shlomo Zalman Auerbach to discuss the matter. After he got a meeting and he came to Rev Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's house, he discussed with him some of the halachic ideas, like we discussed, the Rambam and the Ramban, and the other Rishonim and Achronim. And while he was speaking, Rev Shlomo Zalman responded, "It's not important." The man was a little confused, but he thought he may have misunderstood him. He continued to explain what he had learned, and again, Rev Shlomo Zalman responded, "It's not important." At this point, the man said, "What does the Rav mean? It's not important." So Rev Shlomo Zalman, his answer was just unbelievable and just sums everything up perfectly. Rev Shlomo Zalman answered, "It's not important because you sit here and you're talking about the Rishonim and the Achronim and the views and the Machlekes." He said, "You don't need to go there. You don't need to come on to any of these things. Just open up a Chumash." He said, "It's clear from every single page, every single parsha in the Torah, in all of Tanakh, that it is clearly Hashem's will that we live in Eretz Yisrael." He said, "What does it matter? Mitzvah chiyuvis, mitzvah kiyumis, derabanan, deraisa, this, that, when, how, it doesn't matter. If Hashem's will is for us to live in Eretz Yisrael, what does it matter the status of the mitzvah? Do we want to fulfill Hashem's will or not? The fact is, if you'd like to fulfill Hashem's will, if you'd like to really do the right thing, it's quite clear that Hashem wants us all to live biyachad in Eretz Yisrael, and that Eretz Yisrael is the only home for a Jew." Thanks for watching this episode of Homebound, episode number 2, and I hope you'll tune in again as we come out with more episodes. delving into the hashkafa and Torah aspects of living in Eretz Yisrael, the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael. So thanks for watching. And of course, as always, we thank Hashem for the wonderful opportunity to live in His home, Eretz Yisrael. I'll see you next time.